it's like a sociological thing. It's like, why are people turning to this? There's so many
I think
things that
you're
go into
right.
that.
Yeah, like there's a sickness in our society, and sometimes the medicine is the drugs people take to cope with it,
Yeah.
and that's more of a societal problem.
Welcome, friends, to episode 282 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And this week we discuss Danny Boyle's 1996 film, Trainspotting. Man, I didn't realize just how much Trainspotting informs my knowledge of like Scottish dialect and like sort of the area surrounding like Glasgow and Edinburgh and some of the places they talk about.
Yeah.
This is a fun movie to go back to. I had a great time with this.
I can see the influence of this movie in other filmmakers that have followed it. I think even Vince Gilligan has talked about this movie being an influence. It really, like, I barely remember it. And like watching it, I'm like, man, I didn't remember like anything about what actually happened in it, or very little about it.
Mm-hmm.
But certain scenes, I'm like, oh, I do remember this scene. I do remember this scene. It's like I lost all the context. The scene was familiar. It's kind of a colorful, engaging, like visual feast of a movie, even as we're mostly in like these torn up apartments and looking at a lot of like pretty gross stuff half the time.
Yeah.
It still manages to be like arresting.
Totally. I couldn't help but think about how beautiful this movie is, and it likens itself to a lot of the stuff in the 90s that was like anti-establishment, but also like well crafted in the way that it takes all the rules of filmmaking and it chops them up, but it's still doing it at like a really experimental and like expert level. And I saw a lot of stuff in my research about this film. This was shot in like 31 days of principal photography.
Wow.
They shot at such a crazy clip that most of the takes were one takes, and then it was like moving on to the next thing. And just so much of it on a technical level, like you're talking about the colors, the like playfulness in the editing. We get the freeze frames and the time lapses that look really cool. And then using the use of music and the music of this era and sort of like the punk scene and like the pop scene and all of that combined to make like a really cool snapshot of this time period.
I agree. And like I wanted to ask you about that because we've talked in the past about like having a score versus having a soundtrack.
Yeah.
And you've talked about how you generally don't like it when a bunch of soundtrack like music comes on. You prefer a score, but clearly it depends because I'm with you, man. Like this movie, I think it's perfect to have this.
There's a cheap way of doing it. I think if you take a really popular song and you take like just some random action scene and you throw them together and kind of hope that that goes together, that's different than what Danny Boyle's doing here, or like what Pulp Fiction did with the soundtrack, or you think of like a Baby Driver or something more recent with Edgar Wright, where he's like all the songs that are incorporated into the film he was listening to as he wrote it, and he knew where the cuts would be, and it cuts along with the music. It's very like rhythmic in that way. And so like,
well, and this movie is about a certain subculture, and music is clearly very important to that subculture. The characters mention it several times throughout the film.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important in that regard too, of like, that's part of this lifestyle, and they're kind of showing what the music is like for these people, and what they're listening to.
Yeah, and just great performances too. Knowing like how gritty this was as a film production, knowing that like first of all, the performances are amazing if they're all off the first take. That's incredible. And then some of the technical, they can't be obviously, but it's just like you have like the stunts or like weird hallucinogenic moments where you're like, to get that right, that's not by accident. It's like amazing pre-production. And
I think that's specifically what Vince Gilligan was referencing when I remember it. He was talking about, there's a sequence in Breaking Bad where Jesse does heroin, I think, and he floats, and he was referencing how much he liked the Trainspotting practical effects used to create these trippy moments without relying on bringing in like, special effect like CGI or other kind of things like that. Instead, they're just manipulating the space, creating unusual situations, playing with perspective and things like that to create this like still trippy effect, even as everything you're seeing on screen is real.
And you mentioned the color, like the use of like stained glass for like greens and blues and reds and yellows, and like giant, there's the bar that they come out of at one point. I think it's called the volcano or something like that. And it's all red on the outside, and it's him running after, I think her name's Diane.
Yeah.
and just like how visually interesting that looked. This film, I think, was introducing a lot of people to a time and a culture in Scotland that a lot of international film goers hadn't seen before. So this was kind of like a representation of what it can be like, and it was a big deal that it was like a Scottish film, but it's in the way that it's still tied into Britain is sort of.
Well, clearly there's also something universal about this too. I think, you know, there tends to be underground subcultures, drug culture in every country, mm-hmm. and there's a lot of overlap, right? Especially nowadays, where the internet has really, I think, you know, closed distances between people. But like even then, I think there was some overlap. There were sometimes lags, like things would come over later, things like that'll happen. But these scenes are influencing each other, right? Like the British punk scene and the Scottish and the American and all this.
So yeah, you've seen the film before. What was your take on it this time? Like, do you recommend this film to people? I
mean, speaking on the color stuff, I definitely noticed the way, I guess Danny Boyle is the filmmaker.
Yes.
The way he was using specific colors to evoke certain things. I thought red throughout represented heroin and represented that lifestyle, you know, beyond that, and also the danger and the pleasure. All of that, I think, was bound up in red. And then as soon as you start noticing that, you'll notice how red is situated in every scene, which characters are wearing red, which walls are red in different scenes where like one character is off of heroin and the other one is still on it or tempting them back. Usually that character will be associated with red in some way. I bring all that up to say that like there's a really clever tactic being taken here as a filmmaker, and making it beautiful, making it visually interesting, being very smart with the way that this plays out. And then the subject matter that we're witnessing is mostly from the Irvine Welsh novel that we just covered last week. I was kind of astounded at how much is directly from it. There's a couple of little deviations here or there, but mostly the changes were omission. It was a lot of stuff left out of the film that was in the book, but some of the stuff that was left out changes, I think, my feelings around the messaging of the movie because of what was omitted, right? So I'm still like kind of processing all of that, but I did find the visual language to be so rich and approachable that I was immediately hooked in a way that I wasn't with the book, that kept me at arm's length a lot longer. And the Scottish dialect on screen was 10% as thick as I think what we were reading, in my opinion. It was a lot more discernible for someone who isn't like intimately familiar with that. Yeah, at times they would get, you know, pretty rough, but for the most part, it was like, this is the kind of stuff I'm used to from watching TV. I've seen plenty of films, you know what I mean? Like, I'm fine with this. It's the stuff in the book that was like so deep, and that phonetic spelling of the language that made it very difficult to read. And the film is much easier to digest. And so all of that has me feeling pretty good about this movie, honestly. And I enjoyed watching it for sure.
I was struck by just like how much I appreciated this film. I remember liking it, but now I love it. I was like, oh my God, this is an incredible moment in time. And because it was so vignetted in the book and so torn apart, which was cool, and I appreciate it for that. But the way that this book flows, this story now flows together in the film, I like a lot. And yeah, it's stylish, it's cool. Right away you like it. And like the first half of the story is kind of that, right? Like heroin, it looks like a bunch of adventures, it looks like a lot of fun, everybody's having a great time and nothing can go wrong. And then the reality sets in and we get the, you know, all the consequences to what we've been seeing is so fun. And this gets back into something we talked about last week with Welsh responding to, you know, 20 years on or 30 years on his novel, and the ways that it kind of latched on to people, and this was seen as cool in ways. And I kind of, in putting it all in the context of now the book and the film, the legacy of the story, now I get where he's coming from a little more.
Yeah.
Because it does feel like if you just like, if you watched half this movie, took heroin, and then fell asleep and never watched the second half, you'd think it's the greatest thing ever.
Yeah. I don't know if you saw the comment, but I believe it was Laura from Why the Book Wins commented on our last video that she had a friend who got addicted to heroin and says that this movie is why. That he watched this movie and wanted to try it because of it.
I did not see that.
Now, I don't. This is all secondhand, you know what I mean? So, yeah, but just the idea that could happen is a little bit like that makes you pause, right? When you're like celebrating this movie, right?
Yeah, terrifying as an
Yeah.
artist too, because you're like, does that mean that you are responsible for that kind
Yeah.
of stuff?
Well, I mean, and the movie even kind of addresses this a little bit with what goes on with Tommy and Rent, he is the gateway for Tommy. We all have to circle back to a lot of these questions. I think that's interesting to talk about the legacy, the messages behind the movie. Um, and yeah, it's like you're having fun with it. And we talked about in the book how the book's really funny and how it's this dark humor. And I think the movie's funny as well, for sure. But there's this other element of like everything is portrayed as being so sexy and exciting and fun, and you're with your friends and you're living life to the fullest. Like that's the thing. It feels like this bohemian, like I am just living life to 110%. And there's always going to be appeal to that, especially to viewers who are feeling like their life is stuck in a rut. It's bored.
Yeah.
They're bored and they're looking for something exciting. So you have crafted this to be as appealing as it can be, even as you're showing a lot of like gross shit. A lot of the visual language is still beautiful, you know?
Yeah, and for someone who's like disillusioned or doesn't feel like they have a place, like you can see yourself latching onto something like this. So you can definitely like get sucked into this. So I understand that. You mentioned the dialect, and I think you won't be surprised to hear that. Obviously, with the pace of this film, they didn't have a lot of time to like slow down. And in post production, producers, I think Miramax was involved, push for re-recording of almost 20 minutes of dialogue, softening the accent, the Scottish dialect, to attune it for American ears.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I mean, it worked, I guess. I don't know if that ultimately is like a good thing, but I noticed that it was easier to comprehend for me.
Right. So let's get into some of this development of how this film came to be. Let's talk about Daniel Francis Boyle, who is the director of this film. He's an English director and producer. He's known for his work on films including Shallow Grave, Trainspotting, The Beach, 28 Days Later, Sunshine, Slumdog Millionaire, 127 Hours, Steve Jobs, and Yesterday. His film debut, Shallow Grave, won the BAFTA Award for Best British Film. The British Film Institute ranked Trainspotting the 10th greatest British film of the 20th century. Boyle's 2008 film Slumdog Millionaire, the most successful British film of the decade, was nominated for 10 Academy Awards and won 8, including the Academy Award for Best Director. He also won the Golden Globe and BAFTA Award for Best Director.
I did not know some of those movies were him. That's news to me. That's pretty well. Yeah. Slumdog Millionaire, 28 Days Later.
Yep.
I mean, that's some really good stuff in that list.
That's a really good track record, and I think rightly so. He's pretty highly regarded, especially in the British film scene. In 2012, Boyle was the artistic director of Isles of Wonder, the opening ceremony of the 2012 Summer Olympics. He was subsequently offered a knighthood as part of the New Year's honors, but declined due to his Republican beliefs. And Republican, just for those that don't know, in the UK is against the monarchy, so they want to replace the monarchy with a republic. It's not the same as republicanism in the US.
Yeah, I could see turning down a knighthood. I mean, there's a particular rant in this film where Rent is basically talking about how awful it is to be colonized by Britain. So it would be kind of ironic for the director to then turn around and accept a knighthood.
Yeah, it's cool that he stands by his, because there's tons of people that we love in the artistic community that have taken on knighthoods, but sure, it's cool to see him put his money where his mouth is and decline something like that.
Yeah, it's clearly an important thing for him and for Irvine Welsh, right? Like it seems like they're aligned in that way.
So with the development of this film, there was a producer named Andrew McDonald. He read Irvine Welsh's book on a plane, and then he turned it on to Danny Boyle and John Hodge, who was the writer, in February of '94. Boyle was excited by its potential to be the, quote, most energetic film you've ever seen about something that ultimately ends up in purgatory or worse. Hodge read it and made it his goal to, quote, produce a screenplay which would seem to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, would last 90 minutes, and would convey at least some of the spirit and the content of the book. That quote kind of sounds like snarky to me. I'm like, yeah, he wanted it to be beginning, middle, and end in 90 minutes. Like that's a film. But at the same time, to take something that was more abstract in the way that this book was and do that it's really impressive. And I think he really captured the spirit of the book.
One of the things he did, I think, is honestly a great lesson for any screenwriter looking to adapt something that's a little more scattered like the book is. he took multiple scenes that would take place across multiple chapters of the book, and he had them occur simultaneously, and he would cut between them. That way they aligned, because he recognized there's some certain similarities between these scenes. He interspersed them with each other to give it a narrative direction that the book, these are like sequential, right? And you just are left to like realize that there are some similarities there. So I think it's clever, and it's something that people who are looking to adapt stuff could learn from.
Yeah. So Boyle convinced Welsh to let them option the rights to the book by writing him a letter stating that Hodge and MacDonald, who were the writer and the producer that I mentioned before, were, quote, the two most important Scotsmen since Kenny Dalglish, who's a footballer, and okay. Alex Ferguson, who was the legendary manager of Manchester United. And I know it's it's kind of funny probably for anybody in the UK to hear this, but I'm a Manchester United supporter, so it's like Alex Ferguson is an absolute legend. So for Boyle to say that these two people are in the same league as those two people is pretty incredible. And so Welsh hears this, and he remembered that originally the people wanting to option the book, quote, wanted to make a po-faced piece of social realism like Christiane F. or the Basketball Diaries. He was impressed that Boyle, Hodge, and MacDonald wanted everyone to see the film and not just the art house audience. So Ewan McGregor was always, as soon as the script was written, he was always the choice to play Rent. He previously worked with Boyle in Shallow Grave, and Boyle wanted somebody who had the quality of Michael Caine's character in Alfie and Malcolm McDowell's character in A Clockwork Orange. Quote, repulsive with charm that makes you feel deeply ambiguous about what he's doing. So I feel like he captured that, but that's difficult competition to put on somebody who's been in a couple of films at that point.
I mean, this guy went on to become a freaking massive star, so I think he saw something in him,
He must have, right?
Yeah.
I read that McGregor shaved his head and lost 26 pounds for this role. He also read books about crack and heroin to prepare for the role. He went to Glasgow and met with people from the Carlton Athletic Recovery Group, an organization of recovering heroin addicts. He was taught how to cook up heroin with a spoon using glucose powder. McGregor considered injecting heroin to better understand the character, but eventually decided against it.
Yeah, probably for the best.
For the best, yeah.
I mean, people get really hard on those, like, researching and preparing for roles, and he had a great performance, so
yes.
I can see why he would be thinking about it. I think he must have known that this had the potential to be a really breakout role for him, and he wanted to do it right.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's certain things I think that you gotta stop shy
Draw the
of.
line. Yeah. And this is, I won't go on a huge tangent here, but there's this really famous Reddit thread where somebody posted like, everything's great in my life, and I'm really considering trying heroin just because like I like a lot of different drugs and I want to see what it's like, and I know that I won't get addicted to it and all this other stuff. And it's this 10-year saga. You can go look it up, where this person tries heroin and then like will update periodically. They tried heroin and then they couldn't kick it. They tried it again, and then it became a habit, and then their life fell apart. And then like you can follow this person's post for like 10 years, and they've gone through recovery and relapses and all kinds of stuff. So yeah, this is the drug that like, not even one time. So if Ewan McGregor did use heroin for this, there's a possibility that he isn't the person that we know him as today. So I guess I'm advocating against heroin use here.
It's possible. I mean, I'm sure there are people who try it once and never touch it again. I'm sure it's happened.
Sure.
I think even in the book they mentioned that, like when Tommy wants to try it. I think Rent says like, oh, there in theory there are people who do that, but he got a vibe from Tommy that he wasn't going to be one of them. And then that definitely didn't end up being the case. And it's just like, why take the risk?
Totally.
Yeah, it's not worth it.
Yeah. I mean, but the movie and the story does a good job of explaining like why these people do it and why they stay addicted to it, because it's the best you can get as far as that euphoric sensation and just like how good the high is, I guess.
Yeah, I think they do a good job of showing how miserable their lives are and how stuck they feel, how sort of destitute they are, how much they are. It's a rejection of modern and I guess like accepted society and like life trajectory. The whole movie eschews that, right? Like it starts off with Rent giving this diatribe about about life and how he, doesn't want to go down that route. It's very nihilist. It's all set to this "Lust for Life" song by Iggy Pop. And to me, this is the kind of stuff that would later on be similar to what Tyler Durden would say in Fight Club.
Totally.
It's a different, slightly message because this is more drug related, and Fight Club's different, but a similar like rejection of the status quo and what we're supposed to do according to society. And there's definitely a part of me and a part of a lot of people watching this who resonate with that, feel frustrated with all of the boxes that we're supposed to fit in our lives. And there's an appeal to that. And we circle back to that at the end. And I think that's a lot of the like message of the movie is very just counterculture, the appeal of that other alternative lifestyle.
And that's a lot of 90s movies. I think that we were in such an interesting time in the 90s that this cross section of multiple, and it's in multiple different cultures as well. Like this is the Scotland version. I think you can see some of the American version in Fight Club for sure.
Yeah.
In the marketing and everything of this film, Miramax and some of the producers were so confident in it that they spent almost as much, if not more, on marketing this film than they did creating it in the first place, because they felt so confident after seeing it. McDonald, the producer, worked with Miramax to sell the film as a British Pulp Fiction, flooding the market with postcards, posters, books, soundtrack albums, and then director Danny Boyle actually went and created a new music video for "Lust for Life," which is a track by Iggy Pop that appears in the film.
Yeah, it's the opening song. I think it may even come back later too. Yeah,
the similarities that are going on, and then you got your Pulp Fiction, which is like this indie darling that like takes over in the early 90s, and then a lot of film starts to follow the trends, but also like it was like a generation that wanted to be heard in this really interesting way.
Yeah,
and it wasn't. I
guess this would be like, would this be Gen X? I guess it would be, right?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, Gen X.
I think different generations have different things to deal with. And this generation had like this like loss of self or something that they were all trying to grapple with. And like, they talk about it in the book and in the film, but like this, like, and we're seeing a lot of it today, to be honest with you. But we're reacting in different ways.
Cyclical, right? Like all this stuff comes back in different guises. But I mean, like I said, there's something universal about this, even as it is highly specific to this time and this place.
Yeah. The idea that like it's like even if you have everything laid out and you do everything correctly, you still might not be in the place that you want to be. And then that's not even to talk about like financial situations, like mental health and like all kinds of other things like that were being grappled with in the 90s. I think now are like more out in the open and can be talked about, but we're dealing with a lot of the same things. If you look at like governments not having people's best interests at heart and like people being stuck in dead end situations, like it just, like you said, it kind of, I'm sure there's some of that to each generation, but it seems like we're back in a similar kind of spot to back then.
And that references the interview we heard from Welsh, where he was saying we're right back in it, and there's a reason that young people are looking at this movie and saying, yeah, let's do drugs.
Yeah. Okay. So I wanted to talk about like when this came out too. 96 saw a drastic change in British music with the rise of popularity for Britpop. Although old-fashioned pop was still firmly rooted in British culture. With Oasis dominating the singles chart and the Spice Girls on the rise, the face of pop shifted from guitars to digitized beats. Mm-hmm. Trainspotting soundtrack aimed to champion the alternative music legacy of 1996 Britain, with a focus on presenting electronic music on equal footing with rock music.
Yeah, there was some interesting moments of that, especially towards the end. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. And you think about like the British invasion, when it was like, it was like the Stones and the Beatles came to America, and I think we saw a similar thing in the 90s again, like the cyclical nature of things like this, and music being so integral to this movie, and like the punk scene, the British punk scene being so like definitely, I think, started a lot of what we would eventually see in the States as well. But you have like that really popular stuff, and then you have the underground scene, and they're like coming together in really interesting ways in the 90s.
Yeah, and this movie became, I think, one of the most beloved films for that subculture. I think this is a classic for a lot of people for that reason.
Yeah, and then let's move into the film itself. We can talk more about some of the styles. I do want to talk about the title, which we know from the book what the title means in the context of that story. But
Do
this
we?
doesn't have. Well, they talk about like there's a the father of one of the people says that they're just train
Standing
spotting or
around
whatever.
looking at trains.
And that likens it to
So
people who do stand around and look at trains as like a
right,
hobby, and how
as a
like
hobby.
they are the people who understand it, and people looking at people who are train spotting are like,
Yeah.
I don't get it. Why are you so fascinated in it? And then sort of that's the parallel with the heroin usage and everything like that.
I guess so. Yeah, I was going to ask you like what we make of that title. I noticed in this movie there is a certain sequence when Rent is recovering,
Hmm.
or at one point being forced into recovery, where the wallpaper's covered in trains.
Right.
So that was like the only real appearance of I can remember of trains in the
There,
movie.
there was one
Um,
train when they were about to go on their hike out to the mountain, and Tommy's all energetic. There was like they're like
Train
right there at
goes
a train station,
by.
but it's not. You wouldn't think that the movie would be called Trainspotting after that scene.
It's an interesting title. I think it is like kind of clearly a title that you're supposed to talk about, like why the fuck is this called Train Spotting, and you're supposed to debate, it is kind of it's a hobby. It's not really a job that people can have. It's something people get enjoyment from. You're also like watching the comings and goings of people and business, from like a passive perspective. So maybe there's something there, right, with just kind of observing from an outside perspective. There's the allure of being able to leave. We do see, Renton obviously wanting to get out of Scotland towards the end, and it seems sometimes like people want to like escape their lives, and maybe trains represent a way, like a way out, a path out. So I think there are layers to this that you could start pulling apart. But on first blush, it's kind of like, why the fuck is this called Train Spotting? It makes no sense.
Yeah. I read that Irvine Welsh actually went on record and explained the title, stating that it started out as a euphemism for taking drugs. So you would
Okay,
kind of talk amongst yourself and say like, "Oh, we're going train spotting."
I see. Okay,
Often they were doing it at a train station also. The term gradually evolved to be described as an obsessive hobby that is not understood by people who do not practice it.
yeah, that tracks. I mean, I think that's basically what we were touching on there.
Interesting. I think it's also taken on a life of like, if you understand that people will say, oh, they're train spotting, or they'll use it as a term, not for heroin and not for looking at trains. Like they'll use it as like that same kind of thing, like a euphemism for like they're interested in a hobby that not a lot of people understand.
Oh, I haven't heard that, but I'll take your word for it. Cool.
That's what I read. So
Oh, okay.
yeah, take it up with my notes. All right, so let's move into the plot here and we can dig in. In Scotland, Mark Renton, a 26-year-old unemployed heroin addict, lives with his parents and regularly takes drugs with his friends Simon Sickboy Williamson, Daniel Spud Murphy, and Swanee Mother Superior, their dealer. Renton's other friends, Francis Franco Begbie and Tommy Mackenzie, who both abstain from heroin, warn him about his dangerous drug habit. Growing tired of his reckless lifestyle, Renton attempts to wean himself off heroin with a bare room, food, and opium suppositories from ill-reputed dealer Mikey Forrester, who, I'll say it here so I don't forget it. Mikey Forrester in the film is actually a cameo by Irvine Welsh.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
saw that too.
pretty amazing.
Cool.
I had no
Pretty cool.
idea. No idea
Yeah.
until I read that later. He develops diarrhea and has to relieve himself in the disgusting toilet of a betting shop, then imagines himself swimming in the filthy water as he retrieves the suppositories. Renton attempts to lead a, quote, useful and fulfilling life away from heroin. This consists of him meeting Sickboy in a park where he shoots a stranger's dog with an airgun, supplying Spud with amphetamine for a job interview that turns disastrous, and stealing a sex tape of Tommy and his girlfriend Lizzie. At the Volcano nightclub, Renton notices that his cessation of heroin use has increased his libido. He seduces a girl named Diane Colston, and they return to her apartment to have sex. The following morning, Renton learns that she is below the age of consent and lives with her parents, whom Renton initially assumes are her flatmates. Diane threatens to report him to the police if he does not continue the relationship.
Let's go back to the beginning, right? We get this opening monologue. I love the sequence where when we first meet Rent and all the characters really, but then he gets hit in the head with the soccer ball and then like slowly starts keeling over at the same time that he's keeling over in a different scene
Yeah.
from the heroin, and then he hits the ground, and we have that like there's like a mural painted. It's this like nude woman, but she's kind of distorted and you can't really see what's going on. Her face is kind of odd, and it's like in the plaster of the wall. There's a hole in the other wall. It's this like rancid, place. but it's all beautifully lit, right? And we see this almost like majestic movement by the character. I don't know, it's just immediately pretty stunning.
Yeah. Dealing with like there's like some slow motion being used, and then the lighting that we've talked about is like practical at times. There's these like interesting lamps near the ground. Sometimes they're blue, sometimes they're red. And then, like I said, there'll be different colored lights coming through the windows, and it just gave it this really otherworldly feeling.
Yeah, blue and green both to me would represent like escape from that lifestyle. You know, like the real world would often be stuff that was green. I think the baby at different points would be looking into the room while they're all doing heroin. It would be like coming out of a room where everything was green, just this like all green room. And then Mother Superior, that guy, he was standing in the kitchen that had that like red shade on the glass. Mm-hmm. So he was always bathed in that red light. And so they would be dealing with him, and it was like he was Satan, like dealing this stuff, you know?
Yeah. I saw
super interesting.
And I read that for the look of the film, Boyle was influenced by the colors of Francis Bacon's paintings, which represented, quote, a sort of in-between land, part reality, part fantasy.
The way they would transition between scenes even sometimes blended reality with fantasy.
I think that appeals to me so much to have, because of the hallucinations and because of the drug usage and stuff, you can have the film be so expressionist and so, experimental in those ways. And that appeals to me because, like, yeah, you get to play with this form, the fantasy ideas of like him going into the toilet and like swimming around for the suppositories. That is such a cool scene where you're shooting underwater.
So fucking gross, but then also really cool. And I love the practical effect of him being pulled into the toilet because it does not look big enough for him, but they've clearly like blocked it in such a way that there's something going on where he can actually go, because he really does go into it.
Yep.
It looks so cool. That kind of stuff is like, I love that, man. When they can cleverly disguise things like that, like it looks great.
So cool. And I read that all of that was chocolate, by the way. So it smelled pleasant in there. It was nice, and it wasn't as disgusting.
It looked real bad.
Yeah.
I felt a little bit like queasy during that bathroom sequence. That one got me a little bit.
And starting out a movie with your lead like coming in and just like shitting his brains out, and like it's such a bold thing to do, and like you're just like immediately setting this movie up as like this is a different kind of movie. Man,
it breaks so many freaking boundaries and just tries shit and like goes for it and shows you things you're not expecting to ever see in a movie. So like I have to give it credit for that. I felt like the beginning of this movie is sort of the seduction part. Yes, it shows the underbelly. Yes, we see the fucked up stuff that Rent is willing to do to get those suppositories. But the very start of the movie is, you know, these characters are clearly high out of their minds, but they're behaving in ways like they're like they're kind of like blissed out, right? Like we see Spud like kisses Sick Boy right on the mouth, and Sick Boy's like looking at I think it was Leslie, whoever he's injecting. They're clearly like there's a sexual tension there, all while everybody's doing heroin, and it's like this is the seduction of heroin and the I mean, she directly says like how it's, you know, 10 times any orgasm you've ever had, and talks about all that, and like, you know, beats any meat injection, I think she says, you'll ever get. So like that's the kind of stuff where it's like we're showing you the appeal of it, right? And you kind of have to like stick with the movie to see the rest. But it's such a powerful moment that some people I think walk away with this being the lasting impression. And then like the partying that happens, right? We see several different sort of party sequences. We see people at the club, hooking up. You know, there's a lot of hookups and stuff in this movie. It's a lot of beautiful people, right?
Yeah.
There's an appeal to it.
And your point basically is that like if you leave the movie with that as the moral of the story, then you're kind of missing some of it because you don't get the other side of it.
I think because like this happens a lot with art. It's when we're talking about generalizations, when we're talking about specifics, like specific people are capable of great nuance and like understanding a nuanced perspective and taking away a nuanced message. But when you start taking on the masses, I feel like there's trends, and there's always going to be people who instead oversimplify, latch onto certain things, and there's a little bit of that I think happening in this movie, because I think ultimately the message of this movie is very messy. It's very layered. There is definitely a look how like appealing this is, but also look at all the shit I'm going to show you about how awful it is and what it does to these people's lives. And we see the character struggling to get out of it, and we should be identifying with the need to get out of it and like seeing it as a tragedy when they're falling back into it. But people in general sometimes struggle, even if an individual can get it.
Yeah, and we've had these conversations in the past with like a Patrick Bateman in American Psycho or Tyler Durden in Fight Club, where the artistic literacy just might not be there for the like you said, the broad masses.
Yeah.
To where they're walking away saying Patrick Bateman is such a cool character. I want to wear suits and have a cool, a cool fucking whatever you call it, business card. Yeah. And like that's not the point of the movie. Like the point of it comes at the end, and like you're like, okay.
And sometimes I think about killing people, and now that has justified by this character. Yeah,
it's normalized to treat people certain ways and stuff. Yeah, so the whole point is to like take on the entire journey, and I think that's what you're talking about with the
and it's messy, right? Like I don't know what the answer is to that, and like culpability in art, and like I really don't know. It's an interesting conversation, and one that I'm willing to engage with a lot of different perspectives on, because I think it is an ongoing conversation. But let's move on with here. We meet all the different characters.
That opening scene where they're running and he's giving that speech of like, buy the car, get the house, get married, is such an iconic monologue and so cool. And the way that it comes back at the end, it reminds me of like the Tyler Durden stuff, some of the stuff that he'll say in Fight Club that's so iconic.
That's what I was talking about, that anti-consumerist materialism, rejection of the like accumulation of things. And like that appeals to a lot of people, I think, even outside of the drug. And, it's funny because like I live in Oregon where a lot of drug use has been decriminalized. Weed has been legalized, which I support. I have occasionally partaken in some edibles. And it's like, so I'm not like, trying to like cast aspersions on just like drug use in general. And then like the movie makes a good point. There's like legal drug use. My mother, she's a drug addict, but in a more, like societally acceptable way. But I think there is also extremities of addiction and of use that are clearly a problem. And this movie also is showing that. It's showing the like far side of it. So I think some people look at this and go like, it justifies some like casual recreational drug use, but there's such a slippery slope into that severe hard drug use that can ruin your life. I just think we got to be careful, right? Like what we're championing here. I don't know the answer. It's a messy fucking subject, man, because ultimately I don't think America by any stretch is like handling the shit well. And the criminalization and like locking people up for getting addicted to this stuff, like I don't think that's the answer. Like it's just it's a tricky subject, man.
I mean, with no clear answer, obviously. It's like a sociological thing. It's like, why are people turning to this? There's so many things.
You're right. That. Yeah, like there's a sickness in our society, and sometimes the medicine is the drugs people take to cope with it. Yeah. And that's more of a societal problem.
And like, where are we at with that? How do we fix that? It's just, there's no answer to it. At least none that I know.
I think there is value to pointing out the problem, which this movie does at least a little bit of.
Sure.
But let's talk a little bit about the cast. We haven't really touched on anyone outside of Ewan McGregor. We got Johnny Lee Miller here as Sick Boy, who, I think they really cast him well. I think he captures that like innate charisma, even while the guy's kind of a shithead throughout. Mm-hmm. This version of Sick Boy, I didn't think it was as reprehensible as the one we get in the book, but it's pretty bad too. And in fact, all the characters were like somewhat rehabilitated. I think here they're not quite as detestable as they come off in the book. I still was pretty surprised to see the dog sequence with Rent, especially that Rent took the gun from Sick Boy, who's actually the one who shoots the dog in the book. But it also doesn't result in the death of the dog. It just kind of moves away from it. It just seems like a random act of cruelty, which is shitty, but not as shitty as Sick Boy strangling a dog to death that from a situation he caused.
Yeah, it was rough in the book, and it's cruel in the movie as well. I did read that Danny Boyle was just like off screen, like waving his hands and like getting the dog all excited to make the dog bark all like that off screen. So it's kind of fun. I was just thinking
totally
about like
makes
the
sense.
indie nature of a film like that. Like
Yeah.
the director would be directly off out of frame, like getting a dog to react and stuff. Like it's really cool, and it gives this such a nice like texture and like I said before, like grittiness to where it feels super genuine.
Well, we got Robert Carlyle as Franco Begbie, who is just as fucking shitty in this version as he is in the book. I would say that he's one where they did a really good job. This guy's such a bully. He's such a piece of shit, and they're all just like friends with him. So they're like, well, he's our mate, so oh well, I guess we have to put up with it. The part where he throws the glass over his head and causes that bar fight, he just seems like the worst person.
Yeah,
and it's interesting that he's the one who's like, he's one of the only ones who's not on heroin, and he's like super judgy about it.
yeah, that can be a commentary if you look at it on like he's drinking alcohol almost all the time.
Sure.
He clearly has anger issues. There's some deep seated stuff going on. But
Yeah.
I wanted to read Robert Carlyle, who plays Begbie's take. In 2009, he told a BAFTA interviewer that he played Begbie as a closeted gay man whose outbursts of violence were due to his quote fear of being outed. And then Irvine Welsh confirmed that he wrote the Begbie of the book to have an ambiguous sexuality and agreed with Carlyle's interpretation of the film's version of the character.
Yeah, I mean that was definitely a undercurrent thematic question in the book of like these characters having a lot of toxic and damaging views on sexuality, objectifying women, being very homophobic, and yet clearly there's some evidence of that going on, and how much they all are like ashamed of it, reject it. Especially Rent has a very direct sequence of this in the book that got omitted from the film. At one point, I think is he the one who's talking to Begbie after his experience?
He is, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah. There's a little bit of it here, but I think there's less to like really sink your teeth into in the movie for this, but it's more of a thing in the book, I think.
For like 96, I thought it was interesting when Rent had the conversation about how they were at the club and he was looking around and he's like, feels like at some point 100 years from now or something like that, 200 years, everyone will be
just be a wanker, fluid. I think he said.
and in the way that he's like, and I don't care. He's like, that doesn't bother me. And I think that's approaching some of the stuff that was maybe in the book with Rent.
That's like a little taste of some of the stuff that's in the book. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, for Begbie to have that scene in the car with the person who was
trans,
yeah. I believe. Yeah. Or at least cross-dressing. I thought it was interesting to reevaluate Begbie in that way.
It doesn't save him at all for me. This guy's still. It's like if you find out somebody who has these huge rage issues and has caused all these problems, it's like they have a reason for being so angry.
Yeah, there's no reason.
It's like that doesn't excuse it, right?
No. But I think it makes the character a little more complex than I originally thought.
And we talked about how Welsh returned to this character with like a later novel, so I can see the interest there. Let's move on. We got to talk about Ewan Bremner as Spud. This guy to me has always been this like character actor who I can't even like tell you where I've seen him, but I know I've seen him in a lot of stuff, as he's usually some kind of goofball or fuck up or something. And he is like fully in the midst of that role here. He,
in a stage version of Trainspotting before this movie came out, he played Rent Boy. He played Renton. So interesting to note that like he then came on to play Spud. And he said something about like he felt like his ancestors, or he felt like this movie like spoke to him in ways like his heritage and his culture.
Yeah.
So yeah, it really interesting to hear that. But yeah, he's been in all kinds of stuff, and he's always a trip for sure.
Yeah. And then let's move on to Kelly MacDonald, who I think is somebody else. The last one that we really got to talk about. She plays Diane here. Her role is interesting. We talked about it in the book some. I think it's like worse in the book in some ways, and the fact that we find out she's 14. In both of them, there's a bit of like a forced complicity. I don't know if this is a thing that that gets talked about a lot in film circles, but like the movie forces you to be complicit in a lot of what's going on just by virtue of like watching and enjoying the film. Like I started to feel kind of dirty. I started to feel like I was in this world and complicit in it because I was having fun watching this like super well crafted movie. And then the reveal of, oh, she's actually super underage, yet we just showed you this sex scene that was shot in a way that was supposed to be, exciting.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's like pulled one over on us, even as it's pulled one over on the character. Now I knew it was coming, but like, you know what I mean? Like there's a certain forced complicity there. And it's an interesting thing that for a filmmaker to do, because I do think it draws you in and it makes you feel like you're no better than anybody that you're watching.
Right. And you feel like there is like legitimate chemistry between these people, and how taboo that is and how terrible that is and how predatory that is because she's younger. And yeah, it's like, I don't think that Danny Boyle's signing off on this. I don't think that that's what his intention was. I think that he was like, this is the ugly truth of the matter.
Yeah. Was kind of I'm not trying to like oversimplify and say that whenever you do that in a movie, you're drawing people in, but like there sometimes can be this effect. And I think it's an interesting one to look at.
Yeah. I would say it's definitely a tightrope walk. You have to, if done incorrectly, it can definitely be disastrous. I think it was just enough here to where I wasn't. I mean, obviously it's offending but it's like in keeping with Renton's character for sure.
She ends up playing a role in this movie where she is sort of a lifeline to a more normal life, more innocent pre-drug life. And she is writing to Rent throughout. She seems to be this like angel, honestly, that he has in his life, that he keeps, even though he feels like he shouldn't be talking to her because it's illegal, she still represents this like that element in his life, right? And like that's interesting from an artistic point of view, but it is also a little troubling from the reality of you're setting up a young girl to be this like savior of this man who's fallen into drug use.
I think,
it gets,
and we're on the same page of like,
there, right?
it's never okay for someone of this age to be with somebody that age, period. It's like
really got on a limb there, but
I know, but it's really messy. It's really messy in the way that it's set up. She is set up to be sort of like more innocent, and he's like, oh, if I didn't get pulled into all of this,
right,
maybe at some point I could
like,
be with
we feel like
this.
She's a good force in his life, so we kind of approve of this. And again, it's making us complicit in a way. That's why I just keep coming back to it. It's interesting how it places us in a way where we feel like he actually should probably stay with Diane. This seems like a good thing for him.
Yeah, it's messy.
Even though I mean, clearly I don't think it's good for her. I think we can all agree on that. Rent, even if he is somewhat improved in the movie, like he still seems like bad news to me.
So after several unsuccessful attempts to reintegrate into society, Renton, Sick Boy, and Spud relapse into heroin use. Tommy also begins to dabble in drug use after becoming depressed due to being dumped by Lizzie. Despite the group's shock, grief, and horror regarding the negligence-induced death of Dawn, the infant daughter of Sick Boy and Allison, the group still does not recover from their heroin use. Later, Renton, Sick Boy, and Spud are caught shoplifting. Renton and Spud are arrested while Sick Boy narrowly escapes. Spud receives a 6-month custodial sentence, and Renton narrowly avoids jail by entering a drug rehabilitation program where he is given methadone to help him. However, Renton quickly relapses and nearly dies of a heroin overdose at Swanee's home. Upon returning home after his revival at the hospital, Renton's parents lock him in his childhood bedroom and force him to go cold turkey. Renton is released upon the condition of an HIV/AIDS test, to which he tests negative.
I was shocked at how late in this movie we get our first real mention of HIV. Everything related to the danger of HIV and AIDS and the way it literally kills people, all of that element of the book gets put on Tommy. And it is a turn, right? And we definitely see this guy asked to try it, becomes HIV positive, and winds up dying from it. Through that horrible thing with the toxoplasmosis and everything we hear about. But it felt a little bit to me like defanged, which is weird to say because it is a harrowing sequence. But in the book, it was like everywhere. And people were constantly worried about it. And like people knew, there was always like, oh, I knew this guy this happened to. And then there's like, there was another character who gets it, but like has like a slightly different outcome where he seems to have like figured out a way to live with it. But it's still said he's probably going to die in 10 years. So it's still a death sentence. It felt like a much more of a threat in the book. And here it was just like a one little random thing that might happen to you is you might have that. What happens to Tommy? And it's bad, but it feels more like a I don't know, like a random side thing that could happen to you. It's a risk
but it's not like everywhere.
Yeah, I agree with you. It was unfortunate because it definitely felt like they had to make a decision to feature it less for the sake of like keeping the clip of the movie going, the pacing of the movie. But
and it keeps the tone lighter.
Yeah, but I do think that was a really important part of the book, and just an important subject to have covered and to talk about with regard to drug use and everything like that, for sure.
Yeah,
it's good that it's here still. Obviously, they didn't cut it out completely, but like you said, it definitely doesn't feel as ever present and dangerous, because Tommy's like still kind of like a secondary character in the story.
Right. Yeah.
So we have to talk about the scene where, because I think this is some of the most ingenious filmmaking that's done in the film, is when he relapses and uses heroin for the first time at Swanee's, and then he has this overdose, and he like sinks down into the carpet, and the carpet like creates borders. Those carpeted borders stay up even though he's being dragged down the steps and everything. There's no carpet anymore. It keeps this like...
No, he sees it at the hospital later and like all kinds of stuff.
So he has like a cut off worldview because of the drug usage and everything like that. And
what have we been talking about? The red has come back and is now this the color language of the film has come to a head here, I think, and we see it literally swallowing a character.
And that was done practically too. They just lowered him down on a trap door. It looked really cool. But I kept seeing stunts in this movie for Ewan McGregor where like he's being dragged down the stairs and stuff. Like that looked painful for sure. And there's quite a bit of this. But then that gets to the sequence where then he gets to come out of that in the hospital room where they quickly raise him back out of it. It's such a cool visual trick to like, it's almost like using like a different aspect ratio and then opening the frame back up again. Like he's back into the full view of the world again. And then we move into him going cold turkey with some of the techniques that are used in that room. You've already mentioned it a little bit. They use like an elongated room, like a version of the room that's much longer. Cool. Really cool stuff. And
when the bed's actually pulling away, it creates that effect we talked about, I think in Jaws.
Yeah, famous dolly zoom. Yeah,
that dolly zoom. It's like doing a dolly zoom, but it's actually, I think, physically moving the bed instead. So it has a similar effect, even though it's like not being created by the camera. I don't think it's being created by a manipulation of the space.
Yeah, I think that was probably I think that like there was a dolly with a bed on it.
Yeah, it was cool. Like
basically what's happening when you're dolly zooming is that two things are moving in separate directions.
Right.
So like whether it was the camera, it more than likely is the camera, because you'd have to move the entire room if it wasn't the camera.
Yeah, I don't know, man. It looked like a really elongated room, and we were taking the bed and pulling it on a track away from the front of the room. Whereas like in Jaws, it's a zoom in on the chief's face, right? But at the same time, it's like pulling out, so it creates this weird effect.
I would need to watch it again to know if it was a true dolly zoom then, or if they were just dollying the bed back. Because it's like the change in focal plane, basically. Like you're squashing the image. But really amazing stuff, experimental stuff, and then just all of the
and
crazy...
the baby on the ceiling. I will say that effect has not... It didn't look super convincing. It looked like a doll. Though,
like, because he's like hallucinating and shit. It's crazy. It's like you don't like. It's all part of this like fever dream.
When its like head turns around, you can actually see the joint of the doll head.
But I think that's part of it. I think like that like I said, fever dream. Like it's fucking scary, and it's like of course we know what's happening.
We didn't mention the crib death moment is so dark, and what they show is fucking horrifying. This like dead baby, and it's so interesting that I remembered the baby on the roof, but I didn't remember that, because that to me was more striking and just how horrifying it was.
Yeah.
And then it's also then really telling when Rent immediately goes back for another hit, and even Allison is like, I want another hit too. So it shows how reliant they are on the drug to get them through their lives and get them through anything bad that happens, and how it's like a way to combat that horror.
Totally. Just running, it's escapism, right? They're just like trying to get away from their lives, and especially that
it's really fucking tragic, right? Because it's what caused this whole situation, and they immediately go right back to it.
Yeah. I recommend people go and do some research on this film, because there's a lot of like visual references to like classic films and things that I saw.
There's a taxi driver mural on the wall behind
in the bar.
Rent at one point. Yeah.
In the bar, which is really cool. And then you have like there's a bunch of Beatles references, and like the way that they walk across the street is almost like that album cover, the Abbey Road album cover. with the bags in their hands at one point. And then just some of the other techniques that are employed, like, again, I think this film and a lot of other 90s films are reacting to some of what Tarantino, and I'm not saying Tarantino was the only person who was doing it, but he was definitely like the moment that people can point to and say Pulp Fiction kind of changed, especially indie cinema. And there's like this 90s indie cinema thing that strove to dazzle the viewer with self-conscious cleverness and empty shock tactics. That really, to me, when I read that, was noticeable. I'm like, yeah, that's very true. It's super shocking stuff. The movie's drawing attention to the fact that it's a movie and it's referencing other movies, and the music is diegetic and also sometimes non-diegetic. The handheld feel that we get some of the times when they're tripping, and some of the times when like he's going through it, or like the jump cuts and the zoom shots and freeze frames and all that crazy stuff. That's like, it's drawing attention to itself. It's like saying like, look at the spectacle of this movie.
And for any people who don't know all the film terminology, diegetic is when sound is being played like in the scene and you're hearing it, versus being played by the movie itself as like a soundtrack.
Yeah. And specifically these movies too, were like the music was becoming a character of itself. Like it was interacting with the movie more so than ever before, where a score was meant to be very subtle and subliminally influence an audience.
One other part like that was the time lapse with Renton, and he's talking about feeling depression and boredom, and he's at this like bingo night or something, and he's surrounded by his family, and they're all having all this fun with the game, and he's just like still, but he's not actually still. He moves a little bit, he sways a little bit, so you can see he's really there. And I was like, how long did they have to shoot this to get the sequence where all the people are moving super fast, having a blast around him, and he is just like staring, like kind of dead-eyed, and it conveyed that depression and just like disconnection and coming down off of heroin, how difficult it is here. Another moment that I feel like I've seen a bunch, like later, just in like montages of famous movie moments. Like I feel like I've seen that scene. It's another one from this film that like has stood the test of time.
Super visually interesting. Like anytime you can do that kind of thing, and it serves the story, right? Like it's not just doing it to flourish and do something. It's like it's advancing the story and letting us understand. Like all of us have felt like that before, where the world's just rushing by us. Yeah. So really cool stuff.
Visual representation of depression. It's like one of the best I've seen.
So now clean but bored and devoid of a sense of meaning in his life, Renton visits Tommy, who is now severely addicted to heroin and is HIV positive. On Diane's advice, Renton moves to London and works as a property letting agent. To Renton's shock and frustration, Begbie, wanted for a failed armed robbery, tracks him down and takes refuge with him in his apartment. Sick Boy, now trying to be a pimp and drug dealer, soon joins them. Begbie and Sick Boy later attack two of Renton's clientele, resulting in him losing his job. The trio return to Edinburgh for the funeral of Tommy, who has died of AIDS-related toxoplasmosis. Following the funeral, Sick Boy asks Renton, Begbie, and Spud for help in buying 2 kilograms of pure heroin from Mikey Forrester, with Renton needing to supply the remaining 2,000 pounds asking price. After Begbie threatens him, Renton reluctantly covers the remaining costs, and the group returns to London to sell the heroin to a dealer for £16,000. As they celebrate in a pub, Renton secretly suggests to Spud that they could leave with the money, but Spud refuses. Sick Boy indicates he would happily do so, and Begbie brutally beats a man after a minor accident. Concluding that Begbie and Sick Boy are unpredictable and dangerous, Renton quietly steals the bag of money and leaves the following morning. Spud witnesses him but does not warn the others. Renton leaves £4,000 in a safe deposit box for Spud. Begbie, discovering Renton and the money gone, angrily destroys the hotel room where the four stayed, prompting the police to arrive and arrest him as Sick Boy and Spud flee. Spud discreetly claims his share of the money, and Renton walks away to his new life.
This whole last sequence, it moves to London. We get like an interesting montage of a bunch of like tourists in London, and it's very bright and like happy.
Music's very poppy too.
Very poppy. Yeah. And then Renton is like starting to like adopt this new lifestyle. He's got a job. He seems to be getting his life together. He's talking with Diane again, who represents sort of a lot of the stuff. She's the one who encouraged him to do this. And then Begbie shows up, and then Sick Boy shows up, and they start living with him. And it's like his old life is coming back. And sure enough, he's shooting heroin again because he has to test it for this deal, right? And he ends up shooting it twice, and he says, "This was my final hit." And then he says, "There are final hits, and there are final hits, and what one was that? What kind of one was this? I don't know." And I guess it depends on how optimistic you are, whether or not you think it was actually his final hit.
And then, yeah, the way that the stealing of the money plays out is similar to the book. There's some slight differences here.
Yeah, and this all brings up good points for the fact that there is a sequel novel and a sequel film now. And like there's, because the way that we leave, do we think that Rent Boy or Renton is clean after those two? Is that his final shot? There's a sequel to let us know, possibly. And then also like the relationship between these characters post, Rent Boy running off with all the money, we can possibly see that in the future as well. So I think it'd be fun to revisit.
Knowing about how books are written and dramatic moments in novels, it feels to me like Rent probably does have continued problems with heroin. If we're going to write another novel about him.
Yeah.
That's my guess. I could be wrong, but that is my guess.
Boyle, like soon after this came out, said he wanted to make the sequel to Trainspotting, which takes place 9 years after the original film, based on Irvine Welsh's sequel Porno. He reportedly wanted to wait until the original actors had aged some, but also there was some Danny Boyle, Ewan McGregor falling out. I guess he promised that Ewan McGregor could be the lead in The Beach, which he actually eventually offered to Leonardo DiCaprio. So there was a feud between them. Now this is all just like, what people are saying. Who knows?
Speculation
behind closed doors. But eventually Ewan McGregor said, "I'm totally up for it. I'd be so chuffed to be back on set with everybody, and I think it would be an extraordinary experience." And then comes around 2014, we start hearing rumors of Welsh spending a week with Boyle, Andrew McDonald, and the creative team behind the original film. And then by later in 2014, it's like pretty much a go. And then Boyle wanted the film to come out in 2016, and it eventually came out in 2017.
And it featured Ewan McGregor as returning as Rent.
I believe the whole cast, yeah.
Cool. I'm curious to see it now. This was so good. I'd be interested to see it. The end of this movie, I think, is interesting to talk about because Rent is walking off into the sunset essentially with the money, and he's talking about how he's recognizing, I think he's like, I'm a bad person. He says that. Literally, the truth is, I'm a bad person. And then he returns to this line that we've seen a few times in the movie where he says, I'm choosing life. There's one point where Sick Boy in the like hallucination tells him to choose life. There's another part, I think, where Sick Boy has said it like sarcastically. And there's a couple of times where this choice between life and drugs seems to be do you choose life or do you choose the drugs? And here he's saying, I choose life. And he says, I'm going to be just like you. And then there's another list of all the things that he's going to do that's just like us, the viewer. It is interesting how it engages with that. And he's like smiling this almost like evil smile of like, you'll never know that I'm actually amongst you. You know what I mean? I'm going to blend right in.
I think it's doing what I felt like the book was doing as well. And it's humanizing people who can be seen as other, like, oh, you're tainted, you're afflicted with this addiction. And like people look down on, in society, people look down on people like this. And I think that that's a way for, the story draws human, like we can level with these people on a human level when we understand them and what makes them tick and everything like that. So to see this character succeeding in this way and hopefully getting away from people who are bad influences in his life, and he can possibly, we saw him kind of getting on a straight and narrow. Now there are bad people who are not drug addicts, so there's something being said there too, right? He's like, I'm a bad person,
right? But also there's a certain level of like acceptance there and like recognizing his culpability, especially what happened with Tommy. A little bit of culpability what happened with the baby. The culpability in a lot of shit that's gone down, honestly. So there's a bit of ownership there, which I think shows a little bit of growth maybe for the character ultimately. But it's messy. It's a messy movie. It doesn't have like a clear structure, even as it has been given somewhat of a structure, and it feels more structured than the book.
I was going to say more clear than the book. Here with everything wrapping up at the end, but we don't know that he's going to be clean. We don't know if he's going to, eventually get back with his buddies. We don't know. Well,
you mentioned the book, so I think it's time we got to vote on whether we thought the book or the film was ultimately better here. I'm going to go first, I think, here, and then I'll let you finish. I really enjoyed the experience of covering this. I had some difficulties with the book. I did find it to be ultimately a deeper experience. I did like being immersed in this dialect, even as I sometimes found it difficult to comprehend everything. But there was enough stumbling blocks there to keep me from like unabashedly loving the book. The film has a lot of the same questions I have about like
the effect and legacy of this art, the messaging of it. Yet the filmmaking is on such a high level, and the performances were so arresting and sort of engaging and delightful to watch. I just found myself having a better time ultimately with the movie. So I think I'm going to give it to the movie here. It just, to me, it feels like the way to experience Trainspotting is this way. Even as I think very start of the episode, you asked me like, would I recommend it to people? Certain people. I think I have to kind of get to know you and what you're into and what your taste in movies are, your media literacy, as we've talked about, before I would necessarily recommend it. But yeah, I think I would recommend it to a lot of people because I think it's a very good movie. And it's a really interesting one for sure. I'm glad we watched it.
Yeah, rewatching this, I'm just blown away by what this film is and what it represents to this era of filmmaking. And it's so creatively fun. It's so stylish. You know, it's a story that needed to be told. And I credit Welsh for writing the novel in that way. And he, you know, like we said last week, had some of those experiences. So it came from a really genuine place. So I value that. And I do think that there's a certain richness that the book has that it's not quite as rich in the film, but it's rich in different ways because we're getting like the visual medium's richness versus like the story of like getting these vignettes and getting to live with these characters for a little more time. But I'm with you. I'm going to take the movie because it's so well crafted, and it's one of those miracle movies that you're hearing like, oh my God, they're doing all this in basically one take. They had like no time. The budget was really low. These performances are so like, these are career like this will set you up for your career if you have a performance like this in a movie that does this well. This was a time where it was like time to flip everything on its head and to be like that sort of Gen X revolutionary anarchy, go against the status quo kind of stuff. And this film represents that in a lot of ways with, you know, some of the other ones that we've talked about from the time period. So yeah, this movie's great, and I recommend it.
All right, I think that's where we're gonna have to leave this one. We did want to point out we have merch available through our Patreon. There's like t-shirts and hoodies and like a mug. The art is designed by Natalie Metzger. It's really cool looking, and we would love it if you would consider signing up to get that. It would really help us out. So please look at our Patreon, patreon.com/inkToFilm. We also have bonus episodes on there. We just did a tier ranking for all of the projects that we did from the 5th season of the show, and we like ranked them S through D or F, I think, of like, you know, how their quality as an adaptation. That kind of stuff we do over there is like a bonus content. So if you are looking to support us, that would be a great way to do it.
And make sure to leave a rating and review. Speaking of supporting us, wherever you're listening, make sure that you comment and like the video on YouTube, subscribe, all that good stuff.
And connect with us on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky now. We're on TikTok. We're all over the place. We're adding to film on all of those. We'd love to have you follow us there.
And thank you to Letterboxd for our intro and outro music. It's the track Everyone You Know.
I'm glad we covered it. It was a Patreon selection. Once again, I don't think we've said that enough, but like, thank you for everybody who voted for this. It was a really interesting discussion, and I'm glad we covered it now. Until next time,
keep adapting.